It is probably not news to any New Yorker how expensive it is to live in New York City. After all, the cost of living here is 122% higher than the national average. But what might be news to many is the fact that 80% of New York City households living in poverty are rent-burdened on an unimaginable scale, spending some 70% of their cash income on rent alone, which leaves little for food, medical bills, childcare, transportation, or other necessities. In New York City, rents are high and they continue to escalate while affordable housing is increasingly scarce. Too many low-income New Yorkers are just one missed paycheck away from keeping a safe, stable place to live. Housing is now an existential threat, with eviction dockets heavy and shelters operating at full capacity. I'm Kevin Thompson, Managing Director of Communications at Robinhood, and on today's episode of This Robinhood Moment, we are going to unpack the complexities of the housing crisis and discuss how Robinhood, New York City's largest poverty-fighting philanthropy, is responding. Joining me today is Chloe Sarnoff, Policy Advisor at Robinhood and our in-house expert on all things housing. Chloe, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
Chloe, why is today's housing market at a crisis point for New York City's most vulnerable populations? And what are some of the signs or trends that confirm that we're in a housing crisis?
I would say on the supply side, over the past decade, New York has added 1.2 million jobs, but only 400,000 new homes. So we're growing faster in the economy than we are in our housing market. And New Yorkers don't make enough to afford rent. We see that in New York City, the apartments renting for $2,300 are 14 times more likely to be vacant than those renting for less than $1,500.
So just not enough units.
We don't have enough vacant units that the lowest income people can afford, and not just the lowest income people. So many working families also can't afford to live in New York City.
Housing is then a hardship, and that's certainly a symptom of poverty. It's certainly something that drives it. What is Robinhood doing to alleviate the housing crisis?
Yeah, so I think, there's no one silver bullet for the housing crisis. We just don't have enough housing across the state. But we also know that New Yorkers in poverty can't wait decades for us to build that. We have to do a lot more to help low-income tenants stay in their homes, avoid evictions, and prevent homelessness. And we have to do more to move people out of shelter and into permanent quality housing as quickly as possible. So Robinhood's doing that in a couple of ways. On the research side, we fund some of the leading research organizations across New York looking at different ways to increase our housing supply. Organizations like the New York Housing Conference and others that are really trying to think creatively about how we can get New York to prioritize building housing where we need it, along transit stations, things like that. We fund the Furman Center to do some really important work analyzing the costs of some of these different proposals and the number of households that they would serve. We've also funded groups outside of New York, like RAND, to bring in a fresh perspective to think about what New York can do to bring down the cost of building new housing so that we can add to supply. And on the tenant side, we fund a ton of different tenant advocate organizations working to expand access to housing vouchers, working with the city to try and improve the administration of our current vouchers, and then also thinking critically about what other eviction prevention services we need statewide.
And so you're trying to get all that at scale in some way. And we had this deep dive event here at Robinhood focused exclusively on housing. I want you to tell us a little bit about that and who you brought together and what you were hoping to achieve that day.
Yeah, so last year, Robinhood and the policy team spent a lot of time meeting with state officials, meeting with members of the governor's office and members of the legislature to learn about, how they were approaching tackling our housing crisis. And time again, we got the sense that there was really a stalemate. There was not the type of consensus and collaboration that we know New York needed across the tenant advocacy space, the housing space, the real estate space. And Robinhood is unique in having relationships across a lot of those sectors and with key leaders of organizations across those sectors. And so we thought that it might be a good time to bring folks together to take a look at the data, remind folks, where is our housing crisis disproportionately impacting New Yorkers? How is it disproportionately impacting the lowest income New Yorkers? And do we have the right suite of policy tools in place or under consideration to really meet those needs?
So you had like 100 people there from a lot of different sectors, as you mentioned. What did you learn? I mean, do we have the right policy tools in place to meet these challenges or not?
We started the conversation in the morning about the relationship between homelessness and the housing market. And I think heard from some really great leading academics and researchers in the space, underscoring, yes, we have issues of severe mental health unmet needs. Yes, there's a prevalent drug crisis across the country, but our homelessness crisis is ultimately a housing crisis. We have such high rates of homelessness because we have such high levels of housing and affordability. And so I just think centering that conversation was really important in that, that homelessness is an outcome of an unstable and broken housing system.
And let me just ask a question there. I don't mean to, interrupt your train of thought, but that seems a little revelatory in some ways because it sounds sort of counter to what most people might think of what the homeless situation is.
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate. We are not the first people to have featured that conversation. There's been a lot of important research recently, a great book called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, and we featured one of the authors, Greg Colburn. So there's been great work happening for years on this issue. But I think there is this misconception sometimes that homelessness in cities is a product of how good their social service delivery is, how generous cities are. Oh, New York City has a homelessness crisis because we have right to shelter. And I think part of what Greg talked about is that's not the case. In California, one of the leading, and most important new research studies came out recently showing that the vast majority of people experiencing street homelessness in California are from California. People aren't moving to California because they want to be homeless in California. People are homeless in California because they couldn't afford housing in California, because they fell down on their luck, they faced an eviction, and they ended up on the street.
For the same reasons that's happening here in New
York
City.
And I think a difference in New York City, we don't have a homelessness crisis because we have right to shelter. We have a different type of homelessness crisis. We have a homelessness crisis where the majority of folks are thankfully housed. They're not sleeping on the streets. But we have a homelessness crisis here too, because it is so difficult to afford rent here. It is so difficult to afford housing. And we have great eviction prevention tools in place, but they aren't always funded at the levels we need. We have, we know what works. Vouchers work at helping households afford rent, but we don't have enough vouchers in the market. And even if we had more vouchers, we don't have enough housing to be able to use them. So I think the morning conversation on homelessness highlighted that we do know a lot of what works to mitigate homelessness in cities.
How many people are living in shelters in New York City right now?
They've fluctuated over the past years. The eviction moratorium helped forestall an increase in homelessness during the pandemic. We started to see that tick up after the moratorium expired, 50,000, 60,000. Today, the DHS shelter count is over 86,000 individuals and individuals in families. But there are a number of other providers providing shelter for migrants and asylum seekers. And so that number is likely higher.
And how long do people normally stay in a shelter?
So it depends. And I think another really important takeaway that I appreciated from some of the shelter providers in the room yesterday is not all shelters are created equal. And many of the great organizations, Robin Hood funds, have done a lot of work to bring down the length of stay, to try and get people on a pathway to move out of shelter and into permanent housing faster, under a year for some of those organizations. However, not all, as I mentioned, not all shelters are created equal. And across the board, I think the average stay in shelter right now is still over 500 days.
Chloe, you mentioned the right to shelter. I'm not sure that all of our listeners know exactly what that is. I wonder if you might be able to explain it. Why does it exist? And how does it contribute to the solutions for the current housing crisis and homelessness in general?
The right to shelter, as we understand it today, is a consent decree that originated almost 40 years ago that required the city provide shelter to all single adult men who sought shelter. And over the years, there have been a number of other expansions to that to include families as well. And so essentially, as we understand it today, the city has to provide shelter to all individuals who, can demonstrate that there is no alternative place for them to go. And there are different requirements about the type of shelter that the city has to provide for single adults, families with children, individuals with other sort of health needs.
And is the current migrant and asylum seeker crisis sort of driving the thought on this, or?
There's no question that the arrival of tens of thousands of individuals and families into the shelter system has put severe strain on operations, strain on the budget. And so, yes, the city has expressed their intent to modify right to shelter is a reaction to the current level of homelessness due to the migrant and asylum seeker arrivals. However, there have been efforts across administrations to undermine right to shelter, and there is nothing in the language about the asks coming from the city that indicates that these changes would not also apply to the city's obligation to provide shelter to longstanding New Yorkers. And many of our shelter partners and partners who represent the unhoused community are deeply concerned that if right to shelter is undermined, it will not only mean that the city no longer obligates its responsibility to provide shelter to new arrivals, but could also mean that it puts the city on a path towards refusing shelter to single adult New Yorkers and to families.
Well, Chloe, I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. Clearly, housing is a huge issue, and the housing insecurity issues really drive poverty in a lot of ways and are core to Robin Hood's work. Chloe Sarnoff, policy advisor to Robin Hood, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you all for listening. Until next time, I'm Kevin Thompson. To learn more information about Robin Hood news, interviews, stories of our impact, visit us at robinhood.org.